The Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, has poured a cold water on the possibility of postponing this year's local government elections and says plans are on track to run the polls. Some political parties, including the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, want the elections delayed as the lockdown had limited their ability to campaign and the country faced a possible third wave of infections. So yesterday, the IEC updated Parliament's Portfolio Committee on the readiness to run the elections. Ebrahim Fakir, Director of Programs at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, joins me now live. Mr. Fakir, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time. So speaking to you a bit earlier, and clearly the Constitution does not allow for a postponement in this election, right? But a Parliament can take a resolution. You were telling me earlier there is this doctrine of necessity. Talk us through this.
Good evening, Zelda, and good evening to your viewers. Yeah, it's a well-known jurisprudential concept, and one would invoke this in instances of absolute necessity, such as war, insurrection, a major state of emergency, but our Constitution makes provision in a state of emergency for that. But be that as it may, it's about widespread social upheaval and so on. And a pandemic, I think, would qualify under those conditions. And so what would be required is that there would need to be a discussion at Parliament and a resolution taken. The IEC, for its part, would go along with Parliament and make representation at the Constitutional Court, provided their position that they've done everything possible to ensure that, we can have a safe election. But there's so many unknowns, and there are many things which are even unknowable, Cassandra. Yeah. So, and one of those big things is we don't know whether we will have an effective vaccine rollout. So the reality is that we're in the midst of this pandemic. We need to invoke this thing for practical purposes. Now, one is not arguing that the elections be postponed indefinitely, because one of the conditions of invoking this doctrine of necessity is that it must satisfy three criteria. The first of those criteria is that it must set out a justification for why, and I think we have that. It's a pandemic. Yeah. The second is that it must lay out a contingency plan or an interim arrangement, and that's clear. We would simply be extending the term of office of the current elected municipal councils with the powers and functions and authority intact. But, and the third condition is that it's for a very limited period, for the period of 6 to 8 months, to ensure that there is some kind of population immunity and that the election does not become a super spreader event.
And that's exactly the point I wanted to get to next. So what do you think, in your view, then, what should happen? Because I guess the argument would hold, you've already spoken about the fact that, one could argue we don't have a credible vaccine rollout plan. This could be a super spreader event. And even if it would be allowed, if this could happen over a few days, if the election would happen or the voting would happen over a few days, there are cost implications. Allegations of irregularities are also things that could arise.
Absolutely, and that's the fear. So if it's held, and there are countries and jurisdictions around the world, on our continent, Uganda and the US, of course, whichever everyone is watching, because of the interest in seeing what happens to Mr. Trump. Those countries have had an election. So it is possible to do so. And our local government elections are run on a constituency basis because you vote at the voting station at which you are registered ordinarily. So it would be easier to manage the voters' roll and the crowd of voters, right? You could, as you say, spread it out over 2 days to make it more comfortable and more commodious. But that would have cost implications because not only are you using a greater amount of sanitization and other materials, you're also and ensuring that there's compliance with all kinds of health protocols. You're also using staff for a longer period, using venues for a longer period, and so there's those cost implications. Secondly, as you say, we've got a society which is fairly fractured, political parties being amongst the worst of them, and they literally will be looking for an opportunity and spoiling for a fight. And usually what happens, especially across our continent, is if things don't go your way, you blame the election administrator, you blame the election manager, and you make all kinds of accusations around ballot stuffing, around the fact that there may be irregularities, that there isn't sufficient security of the balloting materials and so on. And then that becomes a whole new issue of its own. So there are inherent dangers either way.
Yeah. Where could this window then be, chance at this election? Sometime possibly August, or where could this window be? I mean, to be safe, for taking into account everything that you've just mentioned, super spreader events, we don't have a credible vaccination rollout plan at this particular point. Where could we find this window then?
Well, what would happen is that, look, the final date for the current, in terms of the current constitutional arrangement and legal arrangement in terms of the Municipal Structures and Systems Acts, that it must be 5 years and 90 days, which gives us roughly the first week of November 2021.
Yeah.
If the doctrine of necessity is invoked, if it is, then and satisfies the two conditions, and then lays out the third condition as being the outlying date of 8 months, which could conceivably be looking at August 2022 for holding the local government election. Because no one is arguing that it must go, as the EFF suggests, until 2024. That would just be an extraordinary extension of the term of office, and that would literally be irregular. But if these three conditions are satisfied and the parameters of the dates are set out, there's no fear, or there ought not to be a fear, that this will suddenly become a precedent-setting exercise, because there are very clear criteria which are being set out for why this is happening. There are parameters which are being set out and what the outlying dates for this would be. So I would imagine August next year. The fear, Griselda, is that if there is still no credible vaccine rollout by then, and we don't actually reach a level of population immunity, then we're faced with the same problem, and we've delayed this election. But at that time, then the contingency would be that we go ahead and hold the election at that time. But at least it gives the society a chance to avoid having a super spreader event.
Ebrahim Fakir, Director of Programs at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.